Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. It's September 1st, and this is the opening of the next season of Home Cooking. My name is Prem Krishnamurthy, and I'm calling in from Berlin, Germany. And just for those of you who may not be familiar with us, Home Cooking is a collective of artists and other folks based all around the world. We've been creating and premiering new performances, activities, readings, artworks, and more since March 2020, during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in Europe. And our first thrilling but absolutely exhausting season of home cooking finished in the end of July. And now we've taken August off to delete Instagram from our phones, restart a little bit, and rejoin refreshed and renewed for the fall. And in the next weeks, we'll be unveiling a whole new set of events and a program that involves artists, curators, poets, and others. So stay tuned on our Instagram page and at our new website, homecookingtogether.com. Homecookingtogether.com. Now, it's a new season, which is also a new context from where this project originally started. I mean, the first phase of the pandemic, with its nearly worldwide lockdowns, social ramifications, economic results, and sheer toll of mortality in different places, particularly that's been levied against Black, Brown, and marginalized communities. Well, it's transitioned into this new, more ambiguous phase where, for some people, myself included, we just don't know what's happening. Can we travel? Can we go out? Can we continue life in some semblance of its old form? Or are we needing completely new structures? And I know that I tend to do best under very clear conditions. Unclarity can be even more difficult than the sheer decisiveness of lockdown or dystopia or even death, which is a very complete and final thing. And I know that for myself, living with uncertainty can evoke panic and it can evoke bodily responses that where you can barely identify with and manage some of these kind of questions that are happening on it. So shakes for me my sense of self sometimes, as connected as self is to the body and the mind, that I can't quite grasp it. And so I find that I need structures to manage this kind of uncertainty. And these are methods and systems for taking action in response to the things that distract me, for organizing the world and myself. And one response can be to try and externalize some of these things that create fear or uncertainty, to get them out of your body and your mind into an exterior brain, like a piece of paper or a computer or a phone, or somewhere else where they don't trouble you directly. And I mean, in fact, this kind of strategy, this is one of the arguments of David Allen's very well known self help management book, Getting Things Done, also known as GTD. It's an international bestseller, and it's still one of the top books in the field. You can find it in any airport the next time you find yourself in an airport. And I mean, one of David Allen's main arguments is that on the route to stress-free productivity, what we need to do is capture all of our open loops, what are unresolved things or tasks, into some kind of external brain, like on paper or in digital. And he also argues that we need to keep these external systems extremely well maintained and projecting into the future. This helps to manage uncertainty and also to allow you to focus more completely on what's at hand, to be more present, to be more mindful, and to allow you to really enjoy the things you're doing rather than always focusing on something else that's distracting you from the periphery of your consciousness. And, I'm very lucky. I've known about this book for about 5 years. I mean, in 2015, when I won the Cooper Hewitt's National Design Award together with my then design studio, Project Projects, I had good friends who gave me the opportunity to, who took the opportunity to give me some really sage advice. And one of these was Matthew Slaughter, who took me out for an early morning breakfast in New York, and he recommended a stack of management theory books. And at the top of the list was Getting Things Done, GTD. And so I bought myself a copy the next day. I put it in my backpack and I started reading it on the subway immediately. But ironically enough, I actually never finished it. I mean, I guess I wasn't ready yet. And let's say I never got Getting Things Done done. But fast forward now to 2020, and one of those great upsides of Corona for those folks like myself who are privileged enough to not be frontline workers, to not have to fight for my job every day and be out fighting for my health and my families and my income. I mean, for some of us, it's given us a lot more time. And for some people, this has meant the time to cook or to bake, or the time to spend locked down with loved or also unloved ones. And in particular, the time, it's given some of us the time to read. And that's really, for me, been important. And so when I finally went with my family on a holiday in mid-July, the first book I brought to read was Getting Things Done. Though my wife actually never avoided chastising me during that entire period for reading a productivity book on my holiday. And I will say, yes, this is very un-European, okay? It is very un-European to read a self-help productivity book while on your holiday. Sorry, I have to, give up my American roots. But I will say it was definitely worth it. David Allen, his methods have really changed my life. And, I think that nearly every best-selling self-help book, it has some sort of kernel to it that you can summarize in 3 lines or so. And I mean, maybe one day I'll make a self-help book that's just a summary of other self-help books. But in this case, I mean, here's a quick list of my top-level takeaways from Getting Things Done. 1 is write down every task and thing that you need to do in a single centralized place. 2 is any task that can be completed in 2 minutes or less, do it right now rather than procrastinating. And the 3rd is for any task or project, always decide on a next specific and physical next step. So you always have to keep things in momentum and think about a next step. And apart from this approach to kind of task management and capturing all of these open loops, I'll also mention that the book's early chapters on project planning are really amazing. They're invaluable in articulating how to approach a complex project in collaboration with others. And I mean, I know a couple of things about projects. I once had a studio called Project Projects, but I've learned some new things, and particularly about project planning processes. So I highly recommend it. Now, I mean, as is clear, I greatly admire David Allen's book, and I think he seems like a really wonderful guy. And I think he's done the world a great service by putting this book out in many, many editions. I mean, all this being said, I do want to offer a couple of points of feedback, maybe even criticism on the book. And, these include the fact that, some of his systems, for example, he has an idea of a physical file folder system called a tickler that is time to remind you of something in a future date that you ought to do. And, this idea of a physical tickler file seems a little bit old-fashioned in 2020. I mean, I also do think that he has a bit of a completist's abhorrence of disorder. I mean, I totally appreciate his desire to close all open loops and capture every single thought and to-do item into a single complete system. But as a creative person, I can say that sometimes it's those messy, unfinished, disorganized, unclassified things that are most productive. And, I used to argue when I was younger, I actually still would argue that every system has its flaws. And these flaws are as important as its successes. And I mean, to be completely honest, I'm still not that organized yet. I haven't closed all the loops. I still have many hundreds of items in my inboxes. So maybe it's just my defensiveness that I haven't been able to implement David Allen's system yet. But, he does seem a little bit dogmatic about certain ideas. I mean, close to the end of his book, after he's come across as a mostly chilled out, relaxed guy, who believes in Zen and other things, he does, he gets a little more serious, and he says, good people who haven't incorporated these behaviors come into my environment and they stick out like a sore thumb. I've lived with the standards of a clear head and hard, clean edges on in trays for more than 3 decades now. When a note sits idle in someone's in tray unprocessed, or when he or she nods, yes, I will, in a conversation, but doesn't otherwise capture that in some way, my uh-oh bell rings. This is unacceptable behavior in my world. There are much bigger fish to fry than worrying about leaks in the system. I need to trust that any request or relevant information I put in an email, on a voicemail, in a conversation, or in a written note will get into the other person's system, and that it will be processed and organized soon and available for his or her review as an option for action. If the recipient is managing voicemails but not email and paper, I have now been hamstrung to use only his or her trusted medium. That should be unacceptable behavior in any organization that cares about whether things happen with the least amount of effort. Now, I hear his frustrations. That makes sense. And, I think that also, having run organizations before, I can understand how that can be terribly, it can really eliminate or reduce your effectiveness. But I think that it can also come across maybe as a little bit too, well, maybe untrusting, or stuck in a certain system, or even paranoid or closed-minded. I mean, to only want to talk to people who already agree with and use your system. I mean, it might even seem a little, cult leadery. I mean, okay, like, I know, I'll give it to you. I'm wearing an open collar shirt from India and standing in front of a big text explaining bumpiness, one of my core principles. So I might not be a good one to talk about not wanting to seem cult leadery. But especially in these days of a rampant exclusion, racism, and more, it seems really important to stay attuned to listening to others, particularly those who are different from you and who have different systems and structures. I mean, when I meet someone with different methods and tools from me, before I criticize them, I try my best, and sometimes I fail, but I try my best to understand and describe them and describe their systems and why they've arrived at them. I mean, that way I can see what I can learn from them rather than try and make them follow my system. And, I'm just imagining some wild-haired, no notebook, chilled out postgrads who don't follow the GTD method. And, I might not be able to learn very much from them about organizational structures, but I might be able to learn a thing or two about psilocybin from them. Who knows? But David, if you happen to be listening to this, please don't take this critique personally. I mean it in the sense of constructive feedback for the next edition of the book, of which there have already been so many. And, I'm actually just following the advice of the self-help guru, Kim Scott, whom you must be friends with. And I'm sure up in that special VIP self-help guru club that exists in that great international airport in the sky, in her book, Radical Candor, which I also highly recommend. She has a couple of maxims, and Radical Candor has an even shorter summary than Getting Things Done. It's only 4 words. I mean, her summary is, quote, care personally, challenge directly. And for sure, I care personally about David Allen and his Getting Things Done methodology, but I want to challenge it and critique it directly so that if he finds it of use, it might make its way into the next edition. But in anyways, we'll get back to Kim Scott and Radical Candor another day. Now, for more years, actually, than I've even had Getting Things Done, I've had a handy app on my Macintosh and on my iPhone that's called Things by the folks at Cultured Code in Stuttgart, Germany. And to be honest, it is my favorite app, hands down. I mean, several years ago, I tried in vain to break my dependence on Apple's global technological hegemony, and I actually tried to buy an Android phone and make the switch from iOS to Android. And then I found out that Android did not support Things. And so, no joke, I went back to the store the next day, returned the Android, and bought a new iPhone instead. And just for the Things app. I mean, that's how much I love it. And Seriously, I mean, Things is an amazing app, but it turns out I haven't been using it very well for the last 8 to 10 years that I've had it. I mean, I didn't realize until I read Getting Things Done finally that Things is named after Getting Things Done, and it follows David Allen's GTD method. And so, pure synchronicity, the whole world came together for me. And so I got back from holiday and I immediately started to reorganize all my lists and my to-do tasks and all of the random notes I had kept in Things. And part of it is that I also finally took a help tutorial in Things and figured out some cool functions and tools to make Things work better. And one of those, which were the tags, which I had never used before. And you know what? Let me just open up my tags right now. And we'll take a look at them. I mean, the tags is this function that lets you tag any given, let's see, does this work? Yeah. So tags allow you to you can organize a lot of metadata about meta categories about all of your other to-do lists and projects. And so, I really burrowed into that in the beginning of August and started to put in tags for all of these different aspects of how to see the world. And, I created nested tags as well, which was new for me. And I mean, the interaction is so simple in Things. The responses are very sharp. I love their app. I will say also in the kind of Kim Scott radical candor mode, folks at Things, if you happen to be listening to this, my only criticism is that it's not very easy to sort multiple tags at a time to move them around as a group, or you also can't automatically sort them into a list or alphabetize them. And so I had to actually manually alphabetize a whole lot of tags, which took some time, but it also gave me something to do and gave me a real sense of accomplishment. But many, many human hours later, I have a structure for my tags, which you can see here, and it's constantly changing, but it gives me a good starting point. So over the next 5 sessions of this program, which I call Structures, describing a system in real time, what we'll do together is simply go through these tags that I've created in Things and open them each by each, which is a phrase that my design partner, Chris Wu, used to say. It's a pretty long task. It'll take us about 5 sessions. And it's also a prototype. It's a bit of an improvisatory adventure since I've never done anything quite like this before. But hopefully it's a fun thing for all of us. And by seeing how I organize my tags, you might take a look at how you organize your tags and learn something from it. So before I begin this journey through the tags, I just wanted to take a moment to ground ourselves in our bodies, something I always think is important, particularly in this online era. So just if you want, take a moment to breathe in deeply, hold it for a moment, and then breathe out slowly. And once again, let's breathe in deeply. Hold it for a moment, and then breathe out slowly. And since I like 3s, we'll do one more. You can breathe in slowly with the count of 3. Hold it for a count of 3, and then breathe out slowly. Great. Now, let's start with the first section of my Things. Categories. Now, some of these things I've addressed in other places, so rather than completely reinventing the wheel, I'll try to read from a couple of other sources. But here in categories, you can see structures, stories, and subjects. And I'm going to read from P!DF, which is an ever-changing electronic book that I've been publishing and republishing with ORG since 2017. And this is from version 5.1.0 of P!DF from May 2019. But let's just start with this section where I describe structures, stories, and subjects. And I say, start out by thinking about this. I say, this is the 15th public release of PDF. It was only while preparing the last couple of versions that I realized the entire book is about developing teachable tools. Tools are not only physical objects, they can be mental models as well. Some tools take 5 minutes to learn, others take a lifetime. We employ and adapt such tools to help us shape ourselves and our environment, even as they shape us. When people describe certain kinds of tools, such as works of design or art, they sometimes use the terms form versus content. In vain, I've recently been asking my friends and colleagues, where does this dichotomy originate from? To me, these particular terms feel linked to the aftermath of the 19th and early 20th centuries. They hint at how that colonialist, industrialist, capitalist epoch of expansion divvied things up. Idea versus implementation, management versus labor, art versus design. Form and content have also gathered so many meanings over the past 100 years that it's hard to pry them loose again. They are such smoothly self-evident words, although everyone uses them to mean something different, that they've lost their value as shared language. So, instead, I've recently started to use a triumvirate of alliterative terms: structures, stories, and subjects. Structures underlie every system. Counting to 10 or 1,000 represents one kind of structure. Whenever people, things, or ideas are organized in the world, their relations are controlled by a particular structure. Because they are often hard to see, structures can possess tremendous power. Stories are a basic impulse. They are intrinsic to any kind of communication, representing the desire to convey a myth, an idea, a feeling, or any other simple or complex narrative. Every story is told by someone or something. It has systems of organization, a way it's told, and a response it seeks to evoke. Subjects are the creatures, processes, and other actors that tell and receive stories. No narrative is objective or neutral. Rather, it arises from a subjective viewpoint. Similarly, every listener carries their own criteria. Subjects are changed by the stories they experience, as well as by internal and external structures. There's an intentional interdependence and overlap between these three terms. Every structure organizes a set of things with a particular agenda. You can't entirely understand a story without examining how it's told and who tells it to whom. And every subject, no matter how quiet, has a narrative that unfolds over time, if only we want to listen. Together, these factors produce social space, the shared environment where interchange, interplay, and interpretation occur. The use of social is not limited to humans. It can exist between different subjects, whether people, animals, objects, or natural phenomena, whenever the interaction is mutual. So this segues perhaps well to the next section, what I call here things, though these are constantly changing. Now, let me be honest, some of the things in my things tags are not as thoroughly thought through yet. It's a way of notation. It's a place to collect categories so that I can use them, think about them, and then adapt them in a continuous feedback loop. But what I'm calling here things, you may have already seen an echo with what I read before. I used to say that, exhibitions and social space and all of these kind of interrelational areas, that they involve people, ideas, and objects. Nowadays, I'm talking about actors, ideas, and objects. And I think that any of the spaces, like the space we're in right now, this virtual space, is a place where they intersect, where they can be in conversation or communion. Are these exactly the right distinctions? I don't know. I mean, I guess ideas can also be actors, and objects can also be ideas, and actors are also objects, depending on the perspective. So it might be a little confusing. And, I'm not sure about this right now. I'm still working it out. But if you have ideas about this, please jump in and let me know your thoughts. I'm happy to discuss. And, it's very easy to change these things, these tags and things. That's the great thing. It's a system that can always evolve. Now, the next category, the next section is what I call discursive levels. And this is really quite specific. I mean, it's something I've started since July, since going on this holiday and coming back and starting to really work with things. I try to, not always, but a lot of the time, if there is time, I try to articulate myself in three different levels. I mean, the first is that I make statements. I make statements about the world, or I make statements about my feelings. So these are all kinds of different statements. And then the second thing, though, is if I can, I try to also articulate my positionality, my subjectivity, why it is that I have made this statement as best as I can understand it, so that I'm not just making a claim, I'm also telling the person listening where it comes from. And then the third thing, if I can get that far, is to try and take from this particular positionality, my positionality, making a particular statement, I try to figure out, if I can, a way to make this into a methodology, a way to actually articulate tools that could be useful to somebody else if they want. And, let me be clear, these three levels, these are an aspiration. I don't always do them. In fact, if I did, everything would take 3 times as long, and I'm already pretty long-winded. But it's something that if there's the time and space, I think it's useful to try and articulate not only what I think or what I observe, but also why I have that particular observation and how somebody else might use it if they so care. So the next section is what I call strategies core. And, this comes out of several years of thinking, and it's very much in progress, as everything else you're going to hear from me ever. I mean, I always am in progress. So over the last several years, I've been trying to articulate 3 artistic strategies for social transformation. And my basic in progress framework is that tries to think of these 3 strategies as not only strategies for action, but also a kind of set of filters or conditions. They're not necessary conditions, but they might be sufficient. They might not be sufficient conditions, but they taken together, they might form a necessary conditions for art to create a truly ethical, complex, and pleasurable form of community. And so I call these 3 strategies bumpiness, generosity, and juxtaposition. And, I've been thinking about these in different forms for several years, and they're still very much in progress, in different stages of progress. So I'll walk you through my thinking about them, but again, I'm happy to take your comments and questions as I continue to articulate them and clarify them. I mean, I'll start with bumpiness, which I've talked a lot about, particularly in my publication P!DF. In fact, the newest version of it, version 6.0.0 from late March 2020, it has an entire section on bumpiness, if you're interested. And to make a kind of short argument about it, I mean, I have been arguing for a while that too many phenomena in our contemporary world are manufactured to be smooth. They are meant to be experiences that we consume very quickly, and where we don't think about the mediation of them or the ideologies that are putting these particular things in front of us. I mean, to give you some concrete examples, think about the one-click buy now button. Think about the kind of format of the 15-minute online talk that's pitch perfect. Think about white cube exhibitions that occur all over the world. And think about easy formulas for how to convince somebody of something. Now, for me, I think that there is this spectrum between what I call smoothness on the one hand and jaggedness on the other hand. If smoothness is a condition in which a particular object or interface tries to make itself seem invisible, make itself seem objective and neutral, even like the construct of whiteness in race itself. On the other end of the spectrum is jaggedness. And this might be a little more like early punk rock. It's things that try to offend for the sake of offending. And for me, somewhere in the middle of that is what I call bumpiness. Bumpiness is a kind of productive friction, something that still has pleasure and still has a tactile texture to it, but that has an irregularity, an unevenness to it, and that also encourages you to think about how something was made, by whom, and for whom. So it's kind of rethinks the format or the norms or the standards or the conventions of a given medium or context, and it tries to create a higher self-reflexivity and critical perception of the message being communicated. And this, for me, is the core of bumpiness. And I will say, I grew up as a children of first generation immigrants from India in a small middle class town in Connecticut. And we were one of the only families there who, didn't kind of belong to a certain group and weren't from a certain place. And I think in many ways, this idea of not fitting in, of somehow creating a kind of less smooth situation is something that's intrinsic in where I come from and how I've grown up. And so rather than trying to kind of fit in with the flow, I've now accepted that I'm always going to be a little bit bumpy, and I'm going to embrace that. Now let's go to the second strategy. This is generosity. Now, I think that questions of care, obviously, particularly in the last 6 months, they seem more and more important these days. But you might ask yourself, how can art or a creative practice be generous? I mean, there are some notes towards this that you can find in books like Lewis Hyde's canonical The Gift, which looks at gift-giving systems in various cultures and literatures and how the mutual reciprocal exchange of gifts can create community. But I think that artistic practice can be generous in lots of ways. Here are some examples. Artistic and creative practice can create space for others. It can open up strands and pathways that can be generative for others to follow. It can also, in a very basic and important way, give us aesthetic pleasure. A kind of artwork can actually give something to somebody that helps them to feel differently, to feel better, to feel joy in the world. But I also think that an artwork or a creative practice can be generous when it exposes itself, when it makes itself transparent and vulnerable, because it allows for others to understand its methodology and not just its artifice. I also think that an artwork can be generous when it embodies an excess of love, when it is made with more effort than is necessary, when it exceeds its ostensible functions and its ostensible context to actually do more in the world. But I want to say that that's not just about working all night and making a thing that's perfectly crafted. I mean, I think that an artwork or an artistic practice is generous when it also has self-love for its creator or creators, when it's not made in a self-destructive way. And when it also, this is even harder to prove perhaps, but we could think about it in something, in a speculative way. Perhaps an artwork or an artistic practice can be generous towards future generations, that it can continue to give over time while still being mutual and reciprocal. And so my essential argument is that perhaps we can start to think about art as something that can write new rules for exchange, for communication, and for communion with others. So the third strategy is what I call juxtaposition. And I think of juxtaposition as the bringing together into the same space of different discrete elements or things. Here, I could use my distinction between actors, objects, ideas if I wanted. But what's important to me here is the idea that juxtaposition allows these different things to each remain distinct and separate while also creating a space that's shared between them. And I want to be clear about this. It's not the very American kind of the proverbial and very American idea of a cultural melting pot where everything is put together and, mashes together into a singular whole. I mean, to be honest, I am very suspicious of things that claim to be wholes. I'll make this argument in another place, but, as I think we can see across different fields from evolutionary biology to neuroscience to quantum mechanics to literary theory, everything that seems to be homogeneous or whole from one resolution or perspective can be further understood as a symbiotic collection of different parts from another resolution. And so I am interested, when I think about juxtaposition as a strategy, I'm interested in structural approaches like sequencing, alternation, contrast, and otherwise, but I'm also interested in the way in which artistic practice can destroy the illusions of homogeneity and uniformity that particularly the last 150 years of narrow modernist perspectives have built within visual culture. And I'm interested in art that embeds different kinds of elements, sources, ideas, and formats into something, into itself. And, I think of it a bit like a space of appearance, and hopefully, I'm using and hopefully not misusing the philosopher Hannah Arendt's concept here, but a space of appearance that allows for the difference between constituent actors and things to come to the fore, while also bringing these together in relation to one another. And I want to quote here the social activist and Linda Good Bryant, who's had an incredible role in the arts in New York and beyond. And she says, "The making of art is uniquely human, and it enhances who we are and how we relate to one another. It makes us more empathetic and understanding of the world around us. It helps us relate to people who we don't see as similar to ourselves." Okay, so I've put here in questions basic, a set of basic questions that I ask myself internally and also in public when I'm trying to understand a situation or a project or even a person. And I often run through them with my clients and collaborators to try and clarify what we're doing. And they can be helpful to ask yourself if you're testing out a new idea or initiative. And so, very basically, I start by asking, by whom? Who is this particular project or initiative or idea by? And this is this question of positionality, trying with as much resolution and texture as possible to understand where you come from and what motivates you. The second is the basic why. Why does a project exist? What is it trying to accomplish in the world on a very top level? The next is how, its principles. And these are the kind of philosophical ideas that underlie it and that guide it, the kind of ethical or structural approaches which we can see resonate through all of its levels. It's kind of its stance, its approach. Then we get more practical. What is a project actually doing? What is it going to accomplish in the world? How is it going to actually accomplish that why, that mission statement, using that how of principles? What will manifest itself in the world? And then a very practical question, which to be honest, I added this question after having read David Allen's Getting Things Done, a kind of how, but more about what next. What's the next step that needs to be done in order to, step or steps to move something forward? So once you've articulated what a project is, what do you need to next do? And then I always ask this question. This is from me having, worked as a graphic designer amongst other things for a very long time. I always ask, for whom is something? Whom are you doing this for? And that helps to clarify so many things. I think many people, particularly people in the arts, sometimes forget that question. And then when? When will it happen? That's very clear. But the question of time, is it going to happen today, tomorrow, the next day, or somewhere else? Okay, so the next section, really my last section for today's segment, is what I call maxims. And these are endlessly expanding. These are just my attempt to collect and capture um, different pieces of wisdom that I've learned along the way from myself and from others. I'll read them now. A system's flaws are as meaningful as its successes. A thing is just a slow event. This is from Stanley Eveling via Marvin Taylor. All art is, quote, social practice. An artwork is never finished. Care personally, challenge directly. You've already heard this one from me. This is from Kim Scott from her book, Radical Candor. Each by each. And this I've also mentioned, my design partner, Chris Wu, quoting somebody else, I don't remember who, but the idea that you just have to go through it one thing at a time. Every event is a rehearsal for the next event. A phrase that I coined together with the curator, Emily King. And this can be endlessly extrapolated because an exhibition is a rehearsal for the next exhibition, a book is a rehearsal for the next book, and maybe even a life is a rehearsal for the next life. Every guru has a guru. There's an endless chain of gurus. And you could compare this to the aphorism or phrase, turtles all the way down. Every person is many people. This is something that the polymathic artist, writer, critic, and more, Brian O'Doherty, once said to me in conversation. He would know he did have 5 or 6 discrete different heteronyms under which he made art, wrote, and did many things over decades. Every system needs downtime in order to upgrade its operating system. Everybody is a footnote in someone else's book. Improvisation requires structure. More joy. On your own, you can only look. With me, you can see. This is something a tour guide in Istanbul once said to me and my colleague. We didn't actually hire him, unfortunately, to show us around the Blue Mosque. We probably would have learned a lot more. This one takes a little more explanation. It's what I call the Patrick Pulsinger Prinzip. And it's something that my friend Florian Brendel, who's a designer in Berlin, told me about 20 years ago. In brief, there's an Austrian DJ named Patrick Pulsinger, and at least as Florian explained it, he used to construct a new techno track by starting with a catchy sample from another source, like a bass line from some tune. And he would build an entire track around this catchy sample. And then the last move before the track was done would be to take out the original sample, to actually delete it, and then leave space so that suddenly the whole song dances around a thing that's not there. Presentation is practice. Process is the only product. Spiritual clarity is a path, not an end. The brain also has feelings. It just calls them Thinking. This is by Emily Ann Smith. The frame itself is always part of a work. The only constant is change. The only thing that there is. The smallest group is a single person. This is a quote from Richard D. Bartlett, an organizational theorist and social technology entrepreneur. There is no neutral display. There is only public art. Time is the only medium. True care is for yourself as well as others. We are all polymaths. This is a quote by Michael Christian McCadden, one of the most talented designers and artists I will ever meet in my life. Why do it twice when you can do it thrice? And finally, from the curator, writer, and critic Vasif Kortun, you don't feed plants, you feed the earth. Okay, well, that's all for today. Thank you for joining me for this week's segment of Structures, Describing a System in Real Time. I hope you'll join me next week for the second episode of 5. And let me end this segment with something that's a ritual of mine. I believe, as I said, in joy. More joy is one of my maxims. And one of the things that brings me joy is dancing. And so I wanted to end with a song that seemed very appropriate to today. It's one of my wife's favorite songs, and it seems appropriate to conclude this first episode of 5. Yeah, I hope you'll join me in dancing. Let's see if I can cue it up. And I'll just tell you the name. It's Howard Jones's Things Can Only Get Better. Thanks again.
Security cut through the wall. Future dreams we have to realize. 1,000 skeptic hands won't keep us from the things we plan, unless we're clinging to the things we prize. And do you feel scared? I do, but I won't stop and falter. And if we grow in time,
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and see you again for the next episode.